You didn't really believe the crew bowed to him by accident, did you?" She ignored it at first, the nods, the special tables, the doors that opened too easily. She wanted to believe he was just a man who made her laugh, who pulled her close beneath Lisbon's lamplights. But illusions drown fast. At the gala, under chandeliers blazing gold, the truth surfaced. The man she thought was her escape was revealed as the very owner of the ship. Gasps filled the ballroom. Her world tilted, and her heart faced a choice she hadn't prepared for. Stay with us, because what begins as a romance at sea ends in a revelation no one saw coming. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Have you ever thought you knew someone, only to discover they were hiding a truth that changed everything? Dakota Lewis paused at the top of the gangway, her hand tightening around the strap of her leather tote as she took in the expanse before her. The Elysian Dawn glittered like something pulled from a dream, its decks lined with glass balconies that caught the sunlight and flung it back in golden shards across the harbor. Crew members in crisp uniforms moved with precision, greeting guests with practiced smiles, while luggage carts rattled across the polished dock. Around her, couples clutched champagne flutes, families posed for photos, and clusters of friends laughed too loudly as if determined to prove they belonged in this floating palace. She moved forward slowly, her heels tapping against the teakwood, her reflection trailing in the gloss of the railing. At 32, Dakota had built a reputation as the one people called when something needed fixing. Funding gaps, broken systems, crumbling partnerships. A nonprofit consultant with more grit than rest, she had spent years pushing other people's visions forward while setting her own on pause. This cruise was her rebellion, her whispered promise to herself that she was allowed to stop. Even if just for 10 days. Inside, the ship unfurled in layers of spectacle. Marble atriums spiraled upward beneath skylights, their staircases lined with brass rails so polished they gleamed like liquid sunlight. A glass elevator glided silently past walls hung with modern art. Somewhere above, a piano played notes that drifted through the air like perfume, mingling with the scent of citrus and sea salt. Dakota slowed, her eyes drinking it in. She felt the tension of the past year. Long nights, endless calls, the ache of always being needed, begin to loosen with each breath. She found her stateroom easily, a private balcony suite overlooking the endless horizon. Setting her bag down on the bed, she slid open the glass door and stepped outside. The city was already shrinking, its skyline softened by distance, while the sea spread out before her in a restless shimmer. She inhaled deeply, the wind tangling with her curls, the salt sharp on her lips. For the first time in months, no one expected her to answer emails or solve emergencies. Out here, she wasn't the fixer. She was simply Dakota. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. An instinct made her reach for it, but she stopped. Not today, not here. Instead, she leaned against the railing, closing her eyes as the ship began to shift, engines humming beneath her feet. She could almost feel herself unmooring, not just from land, but from the weight she had carried so long. She smiled faintly, a private promise. This trip was hers. What she didn't know was that the sea had its own plans, and solitude was about to become a luxury she wouldn't hold on to for long. By the second evening, Dakota had begun to settle into the rhythm of the ship, the slow sway of the decks beneath her feet, the endless expanse of water that blurred into sky, the way laughter and music seemed to float on the breeze long after the bands had packed up. She had spent the day wandering through Barcelona's winding streets, losing herself in the hum of vendors and the scent of oranges that lingered in the air. By nightfall, she found herself drawn to the quieter edges of the Elysian Dawn, away from the crowded lounges and the thrum of conversation. That was when she noticed him. He was leaning against the railing on the upper deck, a silhouette carved against the horizon where the last traces of sunset bled into indigo. The breeze tugged at the collar of his open shirt, revealing a glimpse of tanned skin and the unstudied grace of someone completely at ease with his own presence. He wasn't like the other men she'd seen posturing in tuxedos or chasing waiters for another round of champagne. He seemed still, grounded, watching the sea as though it were telling him secrets. When their eyes met, he smiled. Not a performance, but something softer, a curve of recognition that made Dakota's pulse quicken despite herself. She hesitated, but his nod of quiet invitation pulled her forward until she stood beside him, the railing cool beneath her palms. Up close, she saw details the distance had blurred: sharp cheekbones, a jawline softened by stubble, and eyes the color of storm clouds, shifting gray with hints of silver when the ship's lights caught them. "Beautiful night," he said, his voice deep but unhurried, as though he were accustomed to being listened to. She nodded, returning the smile. "It feels unreal. Like the world stops out here." He introduced himself as Rhett Holt. Conversation flowed easily, slipping from travel stories to books, to the way the sea made everything else feel small. He listened in a way few men ever had, leaning into her words, asking questions that showed he wanted to understand, not just reply. The longer they spoke, the more Dakota felt the quiet thrill of something unfolding she hadn't expected. Her laughter surprised her, bubbling up in a way it hadn't in months, carried off by the wind, as if the ocean itself wanted to keep it. She told herself it was nothing more than the charm of a passing moment, the kind of connection travel creates and the tide washes away. But as Rhett's gaze lingered on hers beneath the sweep of starlight, Dakota wondered if this was the kind of fleeting encounter that could echo long after the ship reached shore. The days seemed to melt into one another, each threaded with a sense of unreality that only travel and perhaps the sea could conjure. Dakota found herself waking before dawn, the horizon painted in shades of rose and gold, only to discover Rhett already on deck with a coffee in hand. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't, but his presence was steady, the kind of quiet that wrapped itself around her without demanding anything in return. By afternoon, the ship docked in ports that felt like postcards brought to life, and somehow, without planning it, Rhett was always beside her when she stepped ashore. In Barcelona, they wandered narrow alleys where balconies sagged under the weight of geraniums and laundry swayed in the breeze. At a crowded tapas bar, they squeezed onto stools meant for two, their shoulders brushing as they shared plates of patatas bravas and chorizo. Rhett ordered in fluent Spanish, surprising her, and when he handed her a glass of Rioja, his fingers lingered just long enough to make her pulse skip. She told herself it was just the wine, just the warmth of the room. But when his eyes caught hers, steady and unhurried, it felt like something more. Lisbon brought music. Fado spilled from tiled doorways as they strolled through cobbled streets that gleamed under lamplight. Rhett coaxed her into a dance with a crooked grin, his hand firm against the small of her back. She laughed as their steps fumbled, her dress sweeping against his legs, and for a moment the city seemed to dissolve around them. When he spun her, catching her in his arms, Dakota felt the world tilt, not with dizziness, but with the dangerous thrill of wanting to let go. On the open sea, dolphins surfaced in sleek arcs, breaking through morning stillness. They stood at the bow, the spray catching in her curls, his shoulder brushing hers in a way that felt both casual and electric. Rhett asked about her work, about what she loved and what she feared. He didn't flinch when she admitted the exhaustion that clung to her, the endless cycle of giving and never pausing to receive. Instead, he listened. Really listened, his storm-gray eyes holding hers as though nothing she said could shake him. The chemistry between them grew like fire fed by salt air, impossible to ignore. Yet Dakota clung to reason. telling herself it was the ship, the escape, the illusion of time suspended. But when Rhett's laughter curled into her chest and the warmth of his hand lingered at her waist, she stopped resisting. Just this once, she decided, she would let herself be swept away. A fling. Nothing more. And yet, even as she promised herself that, her heart whispered otherwise. The spell of the voyage held, but shadows began to creep in at the edges. Dakota noticed it first in small moments, the way waiters straightened as Rhett passed, their easy smiles shifting into something more formal. A bartender who had barely acknowledged her the night before practically snapped to attention when Rhett ordered 2 glasses of wine. She tried to brush it off as charm, the natural magnetism he carried without effort, but the pattern became harder to ignore. Wherever they went, people seemed to know him, though no one ever explained how. One afternoon, as the ship glided toward the coast of Marseille, she caught him speaking with a staff member near the pool deck. His voice was low, calm, but there was authority in it, the kind that carried weight. The young man nodded quickly, tucked away his notepad, and vanished almost at a jog. When Rhett returned to her side, he acted as though nothing unusual had happened, slipping back into their conversation about music and travel. But Dakota's mind snagged on the moment, her curiosity tugging against the comfort she had begun to build around him. She teased him later, half laughing, trying to shake off the unease. "So what's the deal? Secret VIP? Ship's favorite passenger? Don't tell me you've got the crew trained to salute you." Rhett only smiled, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face before he leaned closer. "Maybe I'm just polite enough to tip well." His tone was light, but his eyes, those shifting storm-gray eyes, held a glint that didn't quite match the joke. Dakota laughed, though the sound came out thinner than usual, and let the moment drop. She told herself not to overthink it, and yet unease lingered. Officers in pressed white uniforms nodded to him with the same respect they showed the captain. Doors seemed to open for him without hesitation. A maitre d' in the formal dining room once escorted them to a table that should have been booked weeks in advance, offering apologies to the guests displaced without a word of protest. Rhett never explained, never boasted. He simply accepted it with a quiet assurance that both unsettled and fascinated her. Dakota tried to hold on to the illusion that this was nothing more than a holiday fling, that the chemistry was enough. She wanted to believe the magic belonged only to the ocean air and the freedom of escape. But sometimes in the lull between laughter and silence, she felt a question hovering just beyond reach. Who exactly was Rhett Holt? And why did it feel like everyone else already knew the answer? The night of the gala shimmered with promise, the ship transformed into something almost otherworldly. The grand ballroom pulsed with golden light cast from crystal chandeliers, the air alive with the low hum of jazz and the clinking of crystal flutes. Waiters glided effortlessly between guests, balancing trays of oysters and champagne, while gowns trailed like spilled paint across the polished floor. Dakota stood at the entrance for a moment, gathering herself, her emerald dress catching every flicker of light. Each step she took a ripple of grace. She had chosen it carefully that afternoon, wanting to feel beautiful, wanting to match the extravagance of the night without losing her own quiet strength. Her eyes searched instinctively for Rhett. She imagined him leaning against the bar with that crooked smile, waiting with a glass already poured for her. Instead, she found herself weaving through strangers, nodding politely at men in tuxedos who looked at her too long, at women who offered tight-lipped smiles before turning away. She told herself he would appear, that perhaps he was late. Then the orchestra swelled. A fanfare of brass and strings cut through the chatter, pulling the crowd's gaze toward the stage. The captain stepped forward, resplendent in his navy jacket trimmed with gold. Beside him stood another man, tall, broad-shouldered, his presence drawing a ripple of recognition before Dakota even realized who it was. Rhett. Her breath caught as he moved into the light, his tuxedo a perfect shadow against the gleam of the room, his storm-gray eyes calm as ever. But he wasn't here as her charming companion, not tonight. The murmurs spread like wildfire, lips moving behind raised hands, a buzz of astonishment sweeping the room. Rhett Holt wasn't a passenger at all. He was introduced with solemnity, the captain's voice lifting above the whispers, the owner of the Elysian Dawn and of the entire fleet that bore its name. Dakota's world tilted. She stood frozen, her glass trembling in her hand as applause erupted around her. People leaned in, eyes bright with admiration, as though the air itself had shifted. She felt suddenly invisible, her place beside him rewritten in an instant. The man who had danced with her on Lisbon's cobblestones, who had listened to her fears under a sky laced with stars, was not who she thought he was. When Rhett's gaze swept the crowd and found hers, something unspoken passed between them. An apology, a plea, a truth too complicated to explain in a glance. But for Dakota, the spell had broken. The room glowed brighter, the music soared higher, yet all she could hear was the echo of a single truth. He hadn't been hers to discover. He had been the ship's all along. Dakota slipped out of the ballroom as the applause still rang against the high ceilings, her pulse loud in her ears. The emerald silk of her dress whispered against her legs as she moved quickly down a quieter corridor, searching for air, for distance, for something steady in a world that had tilted beneath her. The laughter and music behind her felt far away, muffled, as if she'd stepped through a glass wall into another reality. All the pieces she had noticed, the deference of the crew, the doors that opened without question, the way his presence commanded more than attention, clicked into place with devastating clarity. He hadn't been a stranger at sea. He had been the sea itself, and she had been sailing blind. On the terrace, the night pressed cool against her skin, the sea dark and endless beyond the rail. She leaned forward, clutching it as though the steel could anchor her, her breath catching in short bursts. What had she been to him? A pleasant distraction, an indulgence for a man who owned the very ship beneath her feet. The thought sliced through her with a sharpness that surprised her. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Steady, unhurried, each one carrying weight. When Rhett appeared in the spill of moonlight, his tuxedo jacket undone, his face stripped of its usual composure, she felt her chest tighten. He didn't look like the man on stage, polished and untouchable. He looked human and strangely weary. "Dakota," he said softly, her name carrying over the wind. She didn't turn. "So it was all a performance?" Her voice cracked more than she meant it to. "The tapas, the dolphins, the way you listened, was I just a way to pass the time until your next board meeting?" He stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, but near enough for his words to reach. "No, none of that was a performance. It was the only time I wasn't performing." His gaze held hers when she finally turned. "I didn't tell you because I wanted you to see me. Not the empire, not the headlines, just me." She shook her head, fighting the sting in her eyes. "You had a choice, Rhett. And you chose silence. That's not nothing." He exhaled, shoulders dropping as if he carried a weight too heavy to set down. "You make me laugh, Dakota. Do you know how rare that is for me? I haven't laughed like this in years." His voice faltered, almost breaking. The honesty in his tone cut through her anger, but the ache of betrayal stayed. She wanted to believe him, to fall back into the warmth he'd offered her. Yet the secrecy clung like salt in her wounds, and she wasn't sure if truth, delivered too late, could ever be enough. The day after the gala unraveled in heavy quiet. Dakota drifted through the ship as though it were a maze she couldn't escape, each turn carrying her past reminders of Rhett. The poolside chair where they had shared lazy conversations, the piano bar where he'd coaxed her into humming along, the promenade where his hand had brushed hers beneath the stars. Now, all of it felt fragile, like glass memories she wasn't sure she should hold on to or let shatter. Passengers laughed and toasted around her, but she felt removed, wrapped in silence that pressed tighter with every step. She kept replaying everything in her mind. His listening, his laughter, the way he had looked at her as if she were the only thing worth watching in a crowded room. Were those moments genuine? Or had she fallen into a carefully crafted illusion, the effortless charm of a man who had built empires and learned how to bend rooms to his will? The questions chased her like shadows she couldn't outwalk. By late afternoon, the weather turned. Gray clouds gathered like bruises over the horizon, the sea darkening until it looked like a living thing. The wind whipped across the decks, sending chairs clattering and umbrellas collapsing. Rain came fast, slicing sideways, herding guests and staff into the safety of lounges and atriums. Dakota followed them, though she hardly noticed her own steps until she found herself in the forward observation lounge. The vast windows stretched from floor to ceiling, framing the storm's chaos in wild, sweeping arcs of water and lightning. She pressed her palms to the glass, the cold seeping into her skin as she watched waves slam against the bow. It mirrored the turmoil inside her, beautiful, dangerous, impossible to contain. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt it, the air shifting before his reflection appeared in the window beside her. Rhett stood soaked through, his shirt plastered to him, droplets still running from his hair. There was no tuxedo, no mask of the man on stage. Just him, unvarnished, unguarded. He didn't try to close the distance with apologies or explanations. His voice was quiet, steady, as though he had carried the words for a long time. "Wealth has never made me feel seen," he said, his gaze fixed on the churning water. "People look, yes. They see what I own, what I build, but not me, not really. With you, Dakota, I'm not invisible." She turned toward him slowly, her breath catching at the rawness in his tone. The storm raged outside, but in that still pocket of truth, something inside her shifted. She wasn't ready to forgive, not yet. But for the first time since the gala, she believed him. And that belief, fragile as it was, felt like the calm at the center of the storm. When morning came, the sea lay smoothed into glass, the storm's violence reduced to a memory that clung only in the salt in the railings and the scent of rain on the decks. Dakota stepped out onto her balcony, the horizon spread before her in a wash of pale gold. The ship moved steady and sure, its engines thrumming like a heartbeat beneath her feet. Something inside her felt steadier too, as if the night had wrung out her doubts along with the storm. The anger had ebbed, leaving behind a quiet recognition she couldn't deny. This was never about the grandeur around her, never about the man who owned it. It was about the man who had chosen to stand before her, stripped of titles, admitting the loneliness wealth couldn't shield him from. That evening, the passengers gathered again in their glittering silks and tuxedos, laughter spilling through the corridors as if the storm had never touched them. Dakota slipped away from the ballroom, drawn instead to the bow. The night stretched endless above her, jeweled with stars, the moon casting a silver path across the water. The wind tangled in her curls, lifting strands against her cheeks. She leaned into it, letting herself breathe in the vastness. She didn't hear Rhett approach, but she knew before he said a word. His presence carried a gravity now familiar, a quiet steadiness that seemed to press the world into focus. He stopped beside her, not demanding, not expecting, simply waiting, as though whatever happened next had to come from her. For a long moment, they stood together in silence, the only sound the rhythmic cut of the ship through the waves. Finally, Dakota slid her hand into his. The gesture was small, almost shy, but it felt like a vow. His fingers curled around hers with a warmth that steadied her, grounding her against the expanse of sea and sky. She turned her face toward him, finding not the untouchable man introduced on a stage, but the one who had danced with her in Lisbon, who had made her laugh at dawn, who had listened when she spoke of exhaustion and dreams. "This was never about the ship," she said softly, almost to herself. Rhett's lips curved into the faintest smile, his eyes reflecting the sweep of moonlight. "No," he murmured. "It was always about you." The fling she thought would fade with the waves no longer felt like something fleeting. It had become anchored, rooted in truth, in the fragile strength of two souls daring to collide. As the Elysian Dawn cut through the moonlit water, Dakota realized she wasn't just on a voyage. She was stepping into something that might carry her far beyond the sea, something strong enough to reach the shore. If this story stayed with you, pass it on. Someone else has believed they were just along for the ride, only to learn they were standing next to power they never imagined. Comment if you've ever discovered someone wasn't who you thought they were. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.